If you're just joining us, welcome to Mapping Our Past, brought to us with the generous support of Sybil Ansbacher. Our final expert of the day is Ted Sickley. Ted is a director of cartographic databases for National Geographic. His team is responsible for illustrating the world around us through the art and science of map making. Today, National Geographic Maps continues this mission by creating the world's best wall maps, outdoor recreation maps, travel maps, atlases, and globes that inspire people to care about and explore their world. Ted holds a master's degree in earth sciences from the University of New Hampshire and currently resides in Washington, D.C. Please welcome Ted Sickley.
Closer? Volume up? Oh, find my presentations all up, thanks. I'm going to test the advanced.
I'll use the arrows. That's fine. All right. Well, thanks very much to Laura and the entire library staff for the invitation to be here. Thanks, everyone, for being here. Thanks very much for the Ansbacher family for the support of this amazing cathedral to maps. When I got the invitation and was told I'd be speaking in the Ansbacher map room, I expected something with wood paneling and low ceilings and very low lights. And in every way possible, this is the opposite of that, and it's absolutely magnificent. So thank you very much. Don't tell my bosses, but I wish we had this in Washington, D.C. So I'm here today to tell you a little bit about the history of mapping and cartography at National Geographic. We've been doing maps since the beginning, and the beginning happened in January of 1888 when a group of 30 or so very distinguished gentlemen met at a private club in Washington, D.C. called the Cosmos Club, which still exists. And they were concerned that there wasn't really any formal way for Americans to know and share and learn about geography. And so they formed a society that would be with the mission to disseminate geographic information and share it with themselves and share it with the public. And so they did this. They began holding meetings on a regular basis. Initially, it was as much a scientific society as anything else. They would give rather formal academic style talks to each other and to some invited members. And then they would publish them in a magazine, the National Geographic magazine. Sometimes the talks would be given by members themselves, and sometimes they would be given by invited speakers. So among the invited speakers at the beginning of the Society's history was John Wesley Powell, who was also one of the founders of the Society. He was a famous soldier and a geologist, the second director of the U.S. Geological Survey. Who else do we have here? Gifford Pinchot was the founder of the U.S. Forest Service. He was among the early speakers at Society events. Amundsen and Nansen were both globally famous Arctic and Antarctic explorers. They spoke. And a woman named Annie Peck, who I've highlighted here. I think she deserves a little more attention. She was one of the early speakers, and she was born in Rhode Island. She went to a kind of finishing school for ladies and a teacher's college, but she really wanted more. She was not allowed to follow her brothers and her father to Brown University because they didn't admit ladies at the time in the late 1800s. So she ended up teaching for a while and found herself in Michigan and was able to enroll at the University of Michigan and get a couple of degrees there, and then went to Greece to study archaeology, and eventually got into mountain climbing. So beginning in the late 1800s, she started climbing mountains, and she would write books about it, and she would give talks about it, and she was able to actually support herself doing this. So she was kind of an early blogger, as it were, but she was one of the early speakers at National Geographic events. And the image on the right here is actually, no, I'm sorry, the left is actually a trading card. She was so well known at the time that there was a trading card for her. And among the innovations that she brought to mountain climbing was that she climbed in pants, in bloomers, which was contrary to convention of the day when proper ladies would climb mountains in skirts. But the photo on the right shows her in her pants, as she should be. So here's an image of the cover of the first edition of National Geographic magazine from October of 1888. It's kind of bland. It was something of a scientific journal. And among the articles in that first edition of the magazine was a story about the Great Storm of 1888 in the Atlantic Ocean, and it included quite a few maps, as you can see. These are kind of small versions of these maps showing the extent of the storm through the Atlantic Ocean and the speed with which it traveled and the direction that it traveled. So we've recognized pretty much from the beginning that in order to really help us tell the stories that we want to tell to our readers, maps are just an integral tool for doing that. There's a sort of gentle competition perhaps between the photo folks at National Geographic and the maps folks at National Geographic, and photos, which are justifiably one of the sort of hallmark issues of, or the hallmark parts of National Geographic today, did not really show up in the magazine until quite a few years later. At the time, photos were seen as a little bit lowbrow for such a scholarly journal. They were kind of something for the general public, but not really for scientists and serious people. So that did come within another decade or two, but at the beginning, maps were seen as something that really could support the stories that we were telling. The very first fold-out map, sort of large format map that National Geographic is also relatively well known for now, was a USGS topographic quadrangle from the Asheville area of North Carolina. And this is certainly well, I shouldn't say certainly because I don't know, but I'm assuming that this is influenced by the fact that among the founders of the National Geographic Society was Henry Gannett, who was the father of the kind of topographic mapping program at the U.S. Geological Survey. So it's sort of how we all know our country very well today, but at the time it hadn't really been done, and he's the one who invented and really promoted this process. And so in the late 1800s, National Geographic included one of these topographic quadrangles as a pull-out, fold-out map from the magazine. This is a map of Europe that was published in 1914. It was published just as things in Europe, well, not just as, but as things in Europe were getting kind of heated before World War I. And I include it here because it's an indication of how National Geographic from early on really tried to provide context to the world itself and what was going on in the world to its readers. And so there was certainly a lot of news reports about what was going on in Europe at the time, and National Geographic kind of capitalized on this and provided this map to its readers to give them an idea about what was Europe and what were these places that were being reported on. And I've read that the editor of the magazine at the time was so sure that this was going to be kind of a blockbuster map that he had a couple hundred extra thousand copies printed and stored in the basement, anticipating demand for it. The aspect of this providing maps for the general public is something that was kind of new. As I had said, the early years of the society and the magazine were that it was kind of a scientific and scholarly journal. But the first full-time editor of the magazine noticed just the tremendous popular demand of these presentations that were given by Annie Peck and Gifford Pinchot and Nansen and Amundsen and people like that. And he's the one who started to kind of shift the magazine from being something of a scientific journal to be something more of a popular journal. He's also the one that brought photographs into the magazine. The story is that there was an issue that he was preparing, and he ended up, for some unforeseen reason, with a few extra pages that he didn't have any content for. And the Society had a number of photographs that were taken on an expedition that it had sponsored. And Gil Grosvenor, who was the editor-in-chief, decided to fill that empty space with those photos, even though it really hadn't been done before. And of course, it was wildly popular, and we haven't looked back in terms of the inclusion of outstanding photography in all of our products. So the popularity of our maps is something that continued to grow. And between World War, or sort of actually during World War I, it was recognized that we really need to have our own map staff. At the time, all the maps that were being included in the magazine were either provided by the authors of the articles or were being commissioned by other cartography houses. That map of Europe I showed had been done by John Bartholomew and Sons, who's still is, under the name of Collins Bartholomew, just an outstanding cartographic house in England. And the USGS topographic quadrangle, of course, came from the government. But we didn't have our own maps department. So in the middle of World War I, I think it was in 1815, we created a maps department to start creating our own maps. And this map of the Western Theater of World War I was the first large-scale map that we included in the magazine. It's a little hard to see. It's a lot of really dense names, and I'm happy to show these later if people want to come up and take a closer look. But the idea here was to produce a map that would be inserted in the magazine, sent out to all of our readers, and allow the readers of the magazine and the members of the Society to have some idea of where their loved ones were that were serving in World War I, because obviously all these place names were coming through and people had no idea of where they would be. And this map was really meant to help people know where their people were during the war. In 1922, the Society produced its first map of the world. This was the first time we had a sort of a large format map of the world. The map projection here is something called the Van de Grunten. It's kind of a roundish projection, which was meant to preserve the general shape and size of the land masses, which is what most people would be concerned about. Mr. Cowdery, our previous speaker, talked a lot about the Mercator projection. Most popular world maps in the recent history before we produced this map were done in the Mercator projection. So they're great for navigation. The direction is correct between features, so it's good if you're sailing a ship. But if you want to compare the size of Greenland to the size of Australia, you just can't do it because it just doesn't work. So National Geographic decided that what we should do is produce a map that just gave people a better idea of what the world really looked like. So we produced this map and used this projection for a number of years until we made similar calculations and changed the map projection that we use for our world maps to one that we thought even better presented the world as it really is. So the innovations that we did in our cartographic work were not just in printed maps, but also in some of the technology involved in mapping in general. So we were involved and sponsored a number of polar expeditions, both to the North and the South Pole. And as you can imagine, magnetic compasses don't work very well when you're close to the poles because everything is either north or south from there. So Albert Bumstead, who was the first chief cartographer at National Geographic, developed something he called the sun compass, which was basically, from what I can understand of it, because I'm not really a technologist in this sense, was basically a watch with a modified little sundial on it so that if it was pointed in the correct direction, the shadow that the sun was casting would tell the user which way was north or south. And so this was employed by Admiral Byrd in, I believe, both his North and South Pole expeditions, and he was grateful to the Society for the help that it provided him. Another innovation that National Geographic brought to map making had to do with how the type, the labels were placed on the map. Obviously, in the olden days, everything was done by hand, and that was time consuming. It was beautiful, but it was time consuming, and if you made a mistake, it was probably pretty complicated to resolve. Later, type was placed on maps using a system called movable type, where sort of like the old printing presses, where you had hard copies of the letters in reverse, and you were able to press that onto some kind of a substance that you could then rub the letter onto the map. And that worked well, except that it didn't work really all that well. The letters had to stick physically, and it was hard to get the very thin parts of some of the letters to show up, and sometimes the little holes in the middle of the lowercase e would fill in. And so it wasn't a very satisfactory way to do the lettering on maps. And so again, Alfred Bumstead, our first chief cartographer, developed something called the photocomposing machine, which used kind of photographic methods to be able to scale the size of the letters that he was using to anything, and it kept the integrity of the fonts much higher than it would have been using any other technology before that. And this 1933 map of the United States was the first map that used this technology. And here's a photo of the workroom, I suppose, back in the day. A couple of guys standing around looking busy, while the two ladies on the right are actually using the photocomposing machine and pulling the type for the subsequent maps. So speaking of fonts, the fonts that existed in the day, the fonts meaning the pattern of the letters, the types of letters being used, were not really optimal for cartography. They probably worked well in printing text and type for newspapers and such, but they didn't work very well on maps. And so over the course of about 15 years or so, another one of our cartographic staff named Charles Rutherford spent time developing some map-specific fonts that were optimized for showing up on our maps. And he ended up developing 33 or 34 of these. We still use them today. They bear the names of various famous cartographers over the years, often having something to do with what their interests were. So Yeager, the Yeager font is for national parks because Charles Yeager, or I'm sorry, I don't remember his first name, but Mr. Yeager was very much interested in parks. So we use that font to represent park features on our maps. But these are all kind of copyrighted, trademarks, so we use them on our maps, but no one else is really allowed to use them. I will say, though, that they don't work all that well on the web, so we've been faced with a new challenge for how do we transition from a print environment to a digital environment and still keep the look and feel of National Geographic maps with some of the limitations of for example, these particular typefaces, but we are certainly working on that. So just about the beginning of World War II, we released this map of the world. It was using a different projection. Again, this one even better than the Van der Gritten projection shown before. This one really keeps the shape and size of features accurate with respect to one another. And it also, interestingly, kind of divides the world into an eastern and western sphere, which is really the way we were thinking about things at the time. So there is sort of a subtle, perhaps political notion involved in presenting this particular style of map at this particular time in history. But World War II was a really busy and interesting time at National Geographic. So we were, as we had been doing in the past, trying to provide our readers with information in the form of our articles and our photographs and our maps that really helped them understand what was going on in the world. So here's a, I'm sure, completely natural, unposed photo of some readers listening to the radio. National Geographic the magazine perched on the lady's knee, and the gentleman is checking out the map that we just looked at to see what was going on. There's an interesting article in the 1995 edition of our magazine which highlighted how maps were used during World War II by both in the sense of what I was just showing, sort of individual people using them to understand the world and what was going on and where these places were. It was also heavily used by the US government. So the map that's highlighted on the first page here of this article is something that was presented to Franklin Roosevelt to sort of let him know where the sort of German positions were in the war I honestly don't remember the year, but I think it was in 1945. Here's a picture of Franklin Roosevelt sitting with the Soviet foreign minister, and behind him you'll notice a map, and that map is inside of what we call a map cabinet. So during the earlier stages of the year, there was some point when Roosevelt was trying to find a particular feature in Southeast Asia, and he couldn't find it on the government-issued maps that he had. So he sent one of his advisors up to the National Geographic Library, which was about 4 or 5 blocks north of the White House. And using the skilled librarians that we had on staff and the maps that we had, he was able to find the feature that he was looking for. And that and other related activities led Mr. Grosvenor, who is still the editor-in-chief of the magazine, to recognize an opportunity here to sort of provide additional information to the president. So he commissioned the creation of this map cabinet, which was a wooden cabinet, probably about 4 or 5 feet wide and 3 or 4 feet tall, a few inches deep. It had big, heavy wooden doors that opened, and on the inside were a series of those pull-down maps that look like window shades that some of us perhaps remember from our elementary school days, and some of us not. But they had maps of all the, and I mean that the young folks, and the maps of all the continents, the world map, and then probably some very particular maps that would be relevant to what's going on in the world today, like that map of Germany that was shown on the previous slide. And so he commissioned this and had it sent up to the White House, or sent down to the White House, so that Roosevelt had it, and evidently it was posted prominently in the White House for his use. And then all those folders that are above Roosevelt's head are individual indexes for each of those map sheets. So if he was looking for a particular place on a particular map, he could just look it up on the index and then find where, using one of those ABC 1, 2, 3 bingo grids, he could find where on the map it was. And we've been creating these and presenting them to presidents ever since. The continental maps and the world maps stay the same, but we do try and alter some of the more regional specific maps to what's kind of going on in the world today. So we've included maps of the Middle East or Southeast Asia or other parts of the world that might have been relevant for the president and the time period in question. So here's a few more maps that were highlighted in that article from 1995 about the use of our maps during World War II. The map on the left is a small map of the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean that evidently Roosevelt tore out of the magazine and then marked up to help him understand what would be the best way for the British and the Americans to divide up the protection of the transatlantic ship convoys that were going back and forth from German aggression. So he just kind of figured out what was in the middle and drew a line down and sort of gave the English the I guess, eastern half, and we took the western half, and we would sort of protect each other's convoys. The map on the right is a map, again, of the sort of western side of the battles in World War II, showing all the different German divisions by name and content. The use of these maps continued after Roosevelt's death. Here's a map of the eastern side of the war, Japan and Asia, that Truman used while they were planning sort of what to do. And you can see on some of these maps, it's literally step by step, 1, 2, 3, what they were planned to do. So these maps were being used to envision what was going on, to give the president an idea of what the current situation was. They were also using it to plan future activities. And then to me, almost most interestingly, the government also commissioned, I'm not sure how many hundreds of thousands of maps that they then took to Europe. And after the liberation of Europe, they actually posted these maps on signboards throughout Europe so that the soldiers that were moving through and trying to figure out what was going on after the defeat of Germany could know where they were going. So I just found kind of interesting. So following World War II, we continued to produce maps, and we continued to try and produce maps that would be of interest to people based on what was going on in the world. So this was a map from the late 40s of the Indian subcontinent. This was released a few years before India became independent from Britain, and the subcontinent was partitioned between India and Pakistan. This was our first two-sided map. The front side showing the main political features and the back side showing a lot of relevant information about the administrative divisions of India. And partition happened, I think, 4 years after this map. So there was certainly a lot of unrest going on in India at the time. And that's one of the reasons why we produced this map. In the 1950s, we turned our attention sort of to the sky. The Russians launched the Sputnik satellite, and that was a wake-up call for a lot of Americans, the government included, and the American people as well. So we produced this map of the heavens in the 1950s, and it's just an absolute work of art, I think. It shows both the southern and northern hemispheres, shows a lot of the constellations. It's got some information about the other planets. And on the back of it is a star chart. And this was obviously in response to the fact that we were thinking more about the sky after the Sputnik launch. And always trying to provide our readers with a little bit of extra. One of our cartographers created this satellite finder, which if you knew from, evidently there were sort of media reports about where the satellites would be passing overhead. If you could sort of plotted where that was and which direction it was going, you could then use this chart on the right here to help you figure out exactly where in the sky to look to see it, because people didn't really know what to look for. We produced a popular globe. We have done that for many years. Here's one from the 1960s. And in an effort to help people better understand the relationship of things in the world, this one includes a little plastic kind of semicircle that sits on top of the globe, which you could slide around. And if you wanted to, as the woman is doing on the lower right, if you wanted to sort of trace the outline of one part of the world, you could then slide the plastic thing over another part of the world to see, well, how does the lower 48 states compare to another part of the world? And then the whole globe rotates in, just freely rotates inside of the frame that it sits in, which has a measuring device that allows you to measure accurate distances between two places. So you could just rotate the globe such that the two places you're interested are somewhere along that middle line, and measure the distance between them. Also in the 50s, we started to get into the atlas business. We hadn't done this before. And our first atlas was kind of a do-it-yourself thing. We'd been producing those large format fold-out maps like the India map that you saw a few slides ago. Those had been included in the magazines as little fold-up things that people could fold out. In the late 1950s, we decided that we should provide people with a way to put them all together and make themselves an atlas. So for a few extra dollars, I think $4.95 post-paid, you could purchase this cardboard set of covers with some binding in the middle of it that just had little adhesive strips. And then as you can see in the lower left, there were also instructions on how you could separate the little adhesive strips and slip in your map of India with some a little damp cloth to activate the adhesive, and then you would have an India page in your atlas, and then you could move to the next one and insert the next map. And I actually have a copy of one here if people want to take a look at afterwards. It's kind of fun. That was followed in 1963 by a real fully published atlas that we did. And we've been producing that every 5 to 10 years since then. We've just released our 11th edition of the Atlas of the World this past year. In the 1960s, as we were racing to get to the moon, again, our interests turned to the sky, and we produced this absolutely beautiful map of the moon. It shows both faces, the light side and the dark side of the moon. It has all of the craters and mountains and other features carefully labeled, and then around it are just packed all kinds of other information about the moon's orbit and the size of the moon relative to other things and the phases of the moon, and then lots of little sort of lunar related names around the margin is just an extra added touch. It's just a beautiful, beautiful map. And then here's some other kind of publicity shots that were produced to help people understand how we actually did this. So we were sitting at getting telescopes and taking photographs of the moon. That's the photo on the left. In the middle, we created subscale models and hung them as they might be with a light source from the sun, so the artist could have a better sense about what the shadows were going to look like. And then on the right is a detail of showing the artist that did this, a gentleman named Tibor Toth, who worked for us for many years. He actually went down to NASA, I think in Houston, for several months and worked with the planetary scientists there to make sure that he got all of the craters correctly rendered. And he hand-painted every single crater on that map. Oceans are another place that we've typically done a lot of both exploration of and publicity for. Back before the 1950s, there wasn't a whole lot known about what was down there. I think most people assumed it was relatively flat and featureless, but there were a lot of oceanographic expeditions going on. And in the sorry, I don't have all my years memorized. So yeah, in the 1960s, there was a few of these expeditions going on. They sort of beginning to understand that there was more down there than just a flat plain. And they're doing a lot of oceanographic expeditions. And among the people involved in this was a woman named Marie Tharp, who was an oceanographer, a geophysicist, but she was not allowed to go on any of these extended voyages because she was a lady, and that was not allowed at the time. So she stayed back at headquarters, and as the data was being collected by the ships, about what was down there, she was instrumental in the effort to actually get this all plotted out. And it was the work that she did with her colleague Bruce Heason that actually led to our revolutionary understanding of plate tectonics and seafloor spreading and things that really we had no idea of before. And we then created some of these beautifully rendered maps of the ocean floors and published all of them as fold-out maps in the magazine and also in our atlases, and really helped transmit this information to the general public about what the ocean was and what was down there and how it worked. We've always been interested in mountains. We've created many, many maps of mountains, and we've always had a special interest in Mount Everest. And we created this map of Everest in the 1980s, along with a gentleman named Bruce Washburn, who is an amazing cartographer. And involved in this effort was getting camera time on one of the space shuttles and hiring a Learjet to fly over Mount Everest and take a lot of air photos and then mosaicing them together. And then Mr. Washburn sat down and hand rendered like this amazing map of Mount Everest. In 2001, of course, September 11th happened, and wanting again to really help our readers understand a little bit more about some of the issues around that, we were able to get published by December of that year this map of Pakistan and Afghanistan, so that people sort of knew again what was going on. Afghanistan had already been invaded by this time, and we wanted to make sure that people knew what was there. And to give additional context, on the back side of that map, we included this detailed map of Afghanistan showing sort of what Afghanistan looked like. There's a timeline across the bottom so that people had a better understanding of the history of the country and the region and why that might be relevant to what was going on there today. And then some additional small format maps on the right just to provide some additional context. We produced this map of the Gulf of Mexico, showing all of the gas and oil infrastructure not long after the Deepwater Horizon explosion. And this, again, is something that we really did because people were interested in it. And we are a journalistic organization. We don't break news the way the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Times Record? Times Union, sorry, the Times Union. But we do cover world events, and so we produced this, what I consider to be an absolutely beautiful map of the Gulf of Mexico, and it has a lot of information on it showing the oil and gas rigs, the pipelines, the oil and gas leases, some of the infrastructure on land, as well as some of the protected areas that border the Gulf. And here's a map that we made of the Yellowstone area. This was something that was produced in 2016. I think it's really just remarkable. It's a remarkable showing of the Yellowstone area. It shows the volcanic hotspot that sits under that. There's some block diagrams on the left that show sort of how the plate sitting on top of that volcanic plume has migrated across, and then the cutaway just shows exactly what's going on down there. And this is all based on real data that we were able to get from experts and render in ways that would just not have been possible, 10 or 15 years ago, given the sort of computing power that is needed. And this was included in a special edition of the magazine that we did on the Yellowstone region, which included some incredible photography, lots of really great stories, and then maps like the previous map that was showing the sort of natural system that was going on there. But it's a very complicated region, and these two maps show the ownership patterns. And so it's a patchwork of federal lands, state lands, local lands. There's conservation interests there. There's lots of ranching interests and agricultural interests. They compete with one another. And so the maps that are showing these different things all going on simultaneously really help the readers understand why some of the issues that are going on there are going on. And then we got a shout out from President Obama in 2015. We had, probably as part of a press release with the release of the previous edition of our atlas, the 10th edition, mentioned having to redraw the maximum ice extent in the Arctic because of climate change. And the President mentioned that, which brought a lot of interest to us. And so we actually went back and pulled that one particular Arctic plate from several previous editions of the atlas, and we were able to create this little animation just really showing quite graphically, how the ice extent in the Arctic has changed. And of course, he knew about this because he had a map cabinet that we gave him. So I wanted to just take a couple of minutes to explain a little bit about how it is that we make maps. Not exactly putting the pen on paper, but some of the processes that we go through and some of the things that are important to us when we make our maps. Certainly accuracy is one thing that is paramount. We have a pretty strong research effort that we go through before any map gets done, and we have a very strong editorial review of things, of the maps after they're created. And here's a copy of a small part of the probably Eastern Europe plate of the atlas that was taken not long after the disintegration of the Soviet Union, when suddenly there were a whole bunch of new countries in the world. We had just released the 6th edition of the atlas. We had to then rush and update all of the atlas plates that included what had been the Soviet Union to include all of these new countries. And then in some cases, we had to actually figure out what the names were because they weren't all in Russian anymore. So this is a little clip of Ukraine, and this was the edit calls, what we call the edit calls, the corrections that were made on that plate for all the Ukrainian place names that had been in Russian and then had to be corrected and updated to be in Ukrainian. And so obviously this took some time, but that's what we need to do to make sure that our maps are accurate. This is an image of a couple of early versions of a big map that we made of British Columbia and the Pacific coast of that part of the world. And it's just meant to show some of the markups that we do, the physical markups that we do when we're sort of reviewing more stylistically the maps that we're producing. It's an incredibly, I shouldn't say incredibly, it's a very long and robust critique period that we go through where the maps are envisioned and the cartographers will start to lay them out, and they go up in front of a lot of people for a lot of review for both the factual accuracy but also the artistic and cartographic aspects of it. And so we are just constantly, as we go through the process of creating our maps, making sure that everything is done as well as possible. And it drives the cartographers crazy sometimes because they'll spend a lot of time working on stuff and then something will come back looking like this and they've got to go not quite back to the drawing board, but they'll have to make a lot of changes. But in the end, we feel it's worth to make that kind of investment of time and effort and frustration to get it right. And then this map I just am showing, it is a map of the sort of global ocean plastics system that we put together a couple of years ago. And I bring this one up because I think it's a good example of how we work with outside experts. Another hallmark of what we do is that we have good researchers, we have a great library, our cartographers are knowledgeable, but in order for us to really produce the wide range of maps and other products that we do, we need to work with the experts in the world on these topics to make sure that we're showing things the way they need to be shown. So we became interested in this plastics issue a couple of years ago and wanted to include it's not quite the big poster size, but sort of a three-page size map of the world showing sort of the issues around plastics in the ocean.
Which are starting to get a lot of press. And so the graphics editor on this, a guy named Jason Treat, did a fantastic job of laying this thing out and identifying the kinds of information that we needed to show on this. And then I started reaching out to people to get the information that we needed. So on land in all those kind of bright blue colors, we're showing the amount of what's called mismanaged plastic waste. This is just plastics that are being produced and are not being either recycled, landfilled, or incinerated. And there are experts out there that measure these things. And so we can identify where in the world are these plastics that may end up in the ocean, where are they being created.
And then you'll see along the coastline, lots of little yellow fan-like features. This is from a data set that we got from another expert that shows the amount of plastics that are flowing into the ocean from the rivers. And this data set had tens of thousands of rivers with individual measurements or estimates of measurements of how much plastics were flowing out of the rivers into the oceans. And so we did some data processing so we could turn it into something that would make sense on a map that a reader would understand and that we would understand. And we ended up with this highlighting of really the most heavily laden rivers with plastic pollutions in the world in yellow. And then all of those kind of purplish, pinkish circles in the ocean are measurements of plastics that were recorded in the ocean by oceanographic expeditions. So that's why they're shown in a lot of linear fashion, because there were ships crossing the ocean and taking samples every so often and measuring how much plastic was in it in various forms. And you can see where it's sort of concentrating in the world, and that has a lot to do with everything to do with both the sources, but also the ocean currents and how things move around in the ocean. And in the lower right-hand side, we have some explanation of how plastics break down in the ocean, just some little graphics showing the different factors that turn something from a plastic water bottle into little tiny microfibers that may end up in a fish's belly that people may potentially be eating. So all that information we got from experts, and we work a lot to make it all look good. And then we always turn it back to those experts to get a final review and write-off to make sure that we have translated all of their scientific expertise in ways that will make sense to readers and to ourselves, but also are still really true and valid to their scientific research. So that's something that we're very proud of, and again, something that takes effort and time, but really needs to be done. So just as a quick wrap-up, there's just a few elements of maps that come out of National Geographic that we're very proud of. We style things carefully. We make sure that everything looks and feels right, and we have some very specific ideas about the types of fonts and letters that we use that make it look like our maps and how we place those on the map. We have a lot of curved names to make things fit better and read better. That's something that not everyone takes the time to do, but we do. We make sure that we work with authoritative sources and to make sure that we really have the best information possible. We review our maps very carefully to make sure that everything is correct, that things are spelled correctly, we're using the right symbols. We also have a very rigorous map policy, which I really didn't have time to talk about, but we have a policy that dictates how we represent geopolitically sensitive areas around the world, like Crimea and Kashmir and Taiwan and other places. And we have to make sure that all of our maps adhere to that policy so that one part of National Geographic isn't calling Pakistan or calling Kashmir part of, all of it as part of India, as India might claim, and another part is maybe representing it some different way. So we need to make sure that we're accurate and consistent. And then we always try to be relevant to make sure that what we're doing is something that will be of interest to people, either based on what's going on in the world or just something that people may not know about that we feel that they should. And then to wrap this up, I just went back into the archives of maps that we've created just to see what we've done with Florida. This was the first map I could find. We have a kind of a rudimentary system of looking up maps by keywords, so this may not be 100% perfect and accurate. But here was a map from, I'm sorry, I've got to put my glasses back on. A map that we published back in 1903 showing, it was a map about Venezuela, just a sort of interest piece on Venezuela, because people didn't know too much about it at the time. But the map was meant to show where Venezuela sits with respect to the Isthmus of Panama and the canal. It was very of interest to people. And then in order to make sure that people could tie it back to where they were, we made sure we included some of Florida on there, which was not just a throwaway. I mean, that's important. So here was the first really big map I could find that focused on Florida. This was a 1930s map, just I think a really beautiful map, and it's got a fair bit of detail on it. It's got obviously lots of cities and towns. It's got the road network, both road and railroad. You can see a lot of swamp still and marshlands and wetlands still in Florida. Some currents off the coast I see, and then some city insets, which would be kind of interesting to compare to what those cities look like today, because obviously Florida is not quite the same as it was in 1930. I did find an awful lot of South Florida stuff, sorry folks, but there were a lot of little locator maps about things like the Everglades and the extent of the tree snail and a couple other things on here. There was an ibis, a locator map of ibis extent. And then the map in the lower right shows the extent of the marching catfish. So another little random aside, as a boy, I was terrified of killer bees. I remember hearing about the killer bees coming up from the south somewhere. And in my little bedroom in New Jersey, I was convinced that the killer bees were going to show up there sometime very soon. And I'm awfully glad I had not seen this particular map, which I think was produced in my lifetime, because if I knew that they were both killer bees and walking catfish on their way to New Jersey, I wouldn't be here today. So anyway, I did find some North Florida maps. This really, I think, sweet little locator map of St. Augustine from the 1960s in the middle here. And then on the right and the left are a couple of maps we included in stories about some of the hydrology of Florida and how that relates to the area, both in terms of springs and rivers and groundwater. But we don't have as much North Florida as South. I'm sorry about that. And then here's another kind of fun map of Florida. This was another statewide map, rotated roughly 90 degrees. And I was thinking about why, when I put this together, I wasn't sure if it was just for artistic merit, just to do something a little different. But I'm pretty sure that just given Florida's geography and a lot of the certainly population centers and the parts of the state that people are familiar with sort of line up in a north-south fashion. So if we had done this perspective drawing, but kept Florida in a more conventional sense, all of the north-south part of Florida would have been kind of compact into a relatively small area. But by rotating it by 90 degrees, you could really show more of the eastern half of Florida. And also when you do the population stacks that you can see in the back, they're not all going to sort of line up and compete with each other. So I think it was done really as a way to best show the information. And then this is a recent map that we released with just a digital news story about a proposed highway improvement corridor in central Florida to link, I believe it's Naples and Orlando area, and how that relates to panther habitat and a few other things. So basically, conservation is certainly something that we cover quite extensively, and this was a map that we produced in support of one of those stories. And then I will close with this one. So this is a map that we produced. It was in a story from the 1950s, I believe, about Florida's booming and beleaguered central area. So if the library staff would like a copy of this to include on the walls with the Ansbacher, I can totally hook you up with that. So, that's it. Thank you very much. And I'll take questions.
These days, society is a media empire on producing video content. Like how does the breakdown these days of publishing versus expedition versus the new media?
That could take another hour to answer because we've gone through a couple of structural and ownership changes over the last couple of years, but the current state of things is that the National Geographic Society exists as an independent, private, nonprofit organization. It's got a few hundred employees, and it manages an endowment with which they fund exploration and research, storytelling, geography education. I work in a related company now called National Geographic Partners, which was spun off of the Society about 4 or 5 years ago, which includes all the magazines, the book division, the TV channel, all of our digital operations. That's probably 1,000 employees or so. That is currently a joint venture of the Society and now the Walt Disney Corporation. So I have close ties to Florida and hope to be visiting more soon as my park pass shows up. In terms of what we do, the relationship between those two organizations are that the Society is funding lots of research and exploration and interesting activities that are generating stories. But they can't really produce those stories because that's not their mission. Our mission is to do that. So we take the information and the stories and all the fascinating stuff that they're doing, and we have the sort of rights of first refusal to turn those into stories for the magazine, for the TV channel, for things like that. That, of course, generates revenue, some of which goes back to the Society because they are a partial owner. So it is meant to be this virtuous circle of activities. So the group that I work with doesn't really do any exploration or research or things like that, but the Society is still a big and robust organization that does an awful lot of that, and they're out there. They've got something called the Pristine Seas program, which is identifying areas of the ocean that really should be protected. They've been investigating the Okavango Delta area of southern Africa, which is one of the largest inland deltas in the world and just hosts a tremendous amount of wildlife. And they just do a lot of these activities that are still exactly what National Geographic has always done. And then we're doing publishing of the magazine just as has always been done. So all those activities are still going on. It's just sort of structured a little different.
So why don't we teach geography in school?
You'll have to talk to your local boards of education about that, I think. What's that?
But I mean, it's just, it's correct.
Well, I think it's something that I don't work in geography education, so anything here is going to be conjecture. But I think it's one of these things that is up against competition with a lot of other subjects, and it certainly is not included in curricula as it used to be. Just another plug for us. We certainly do a lot of geography education activities, and we do as much as we can to get it into the schools and get it into the hands of teachers that are able to do it. But you're absolutely right. It's not something that is taught explicitly as it should be. I'll just say it.
How many of the National Geographic maps have been digitized and made available for research and general use?
They've all been digitized. They are all available through what's called the Complete National Geographic, which is a basically digital representation of the magazine. We pretty much went back, took a copy of every magazine back to October of 1888 and carefully separated it all apart and scanned it. And that's all available. Currently, I know it's available if you're a subscriber and a member of the society. I don't know how the just general public who is not a member of the society would access it. But if you were to join the society and subscribe to the magazine, hint, hint, you would have access to that. And so it's got a pretty intuitive way that you can go in there and search either based on topic or on date and find everything and just sort of flip through the magazine. And honestly, to do it for some of the ads back in like the 1920s and 30s and 40s is just fascinating. So that in and of itself could be a whole cultural research project, but anyway.
I don't want to be corrected by a lot of staff member, but I think I might be saying that you can go online to the Jacksonville Classic catalog and see the digital magazines.
It would make perfect
sense. The whole collection, am I right?
Great. Yeah, it would make sense that the library would subscribe to that.
So it would be free.
It would be free if you come to the library. Yeah. Excuse me? That's a very good question. We are constantly updating the data that we use to make our maps, and we try to use the best information available.
No, I mean, actually being able to read and see the details in a big
That we actually have some staff that are responsible for converting things from like the print version of maps to like a digital version. And that's further complicated because we have one version which is kind of for your laptop computer or your mainframe or your desktop computer, and another for phone. So sometimes we have to take like that plastics map. I don't know exactly how we did, but sometimes we have to take a map like that, which may have many elements, and break it apart into individual elements that can be either put on separate pages or stacked. We've had to like rotate maps because on your computer screen, maybe it looks great this way, but you put it on your phone and it's going to be that big, so we have to like rotate it 90 degrees. It is a challenge. And sometimes we just have to simplify it, and you just can't show as much information on the digital form as might be included in the print form. So, but you can come to your library and look it up.
How do you map North Korea?
Do you mean like how do we get the information about it? We use a lot of US government sources because they have researchers that are, for example, tracking place names in North Korea, and that is one thing that we would always be including on our maps. Certainly with satellite imagery, we can get a lot of information about like the physical aspects of the country, which might not have been available before widespread satellite imagery. And then there are also other non-governmental organizations that are also collecting data as much as possible, and whenever we can and whenever we need to, we reach out to organizations like that. But there are certainly many parts of the world where the information that we would like to have available is not, and things are more challenging to deal with. All right.
Many thanks again to Ted Sickley, Pete Cowdrey, Steve Williams, and Joe Carrigley for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And of course, thanks again to Sybil Ansbacher for making this event possible. We thank you for attending Mapping Our Past and want you to know that you can continue to experience our special collections. A few of the options include scheduling a personal or group tour of the Ansbacher Map Room. You can book an appointment for local history or genealogy research assistance, and you can donate a local high school yearbook to our collection. We would really appreciate that. No matter how you engage with the Jacksonville Public Library, we look forward to serving you. Thank you for spending your afternoon with us.